Mountain man found starving old couple huddled in his cabin. What happened next shocked the town. The wind roared through the Wyoming peaks like a beast unchained, sweeping drifts of white across the ridgeline. Snowflakes the size of dimes stung Elias McGraw's face as he pushed forward through the storm, his boots sinking deep into the powder. It had been 14 days since he'd left his cabin. 14 days of trapping, hauling, and skinning game, alone as always. His pack was heavy with hides, but his body was heavier still with weariness. The mountains didn't forgive the weak, and Elias had long ago learned to match their silence. A thick gray beard framed his wind-burned face, streaked with frost. His coat, patched elk hide, worn thin at the elbows, was crusted with ice. The rifle slung over his back was his only companion, save for the memories that clung like ghosts in the cold. He was a man made by the wilderness, and broken by it too. As he crested the final ridge, his boots crunching over frozen brush, his eyes caught something that made his heart stutter. Smoke. A thin wisp, barely visible through the storm, curling from the chimney of his cabin down in the hollow. He stopped dead in his tracks, breathing hard. That shouldn't be there. No one came this far into the range. Bitter Creek was 15 miles down the trail, and even trappers stayed away once the snows came in. The last time someone found their way this deep, it was a prospector who froze to death less than a mile from the creek. Elias's gloved hand tightened around the rifle's grip. He scanned the treeline. Nothing moved but the swirling flakes. No footprints, no smoke elsewhere. Just that one faint plume twisting upward like a warning. Slowly he started down the ridge, boots sliding, rifle ready. His breath fogged the air in heavy clouds. Each step closer, the unease in his gut grew. Whoever was inside that cabin had either lost their mind, or had nowhere else left to go. By the time he reached the clearing, the snow had already swallowed most of his tracks. The cabin stood half-buried, rough-hewn logs darkened by frost, roof sagging under the weight of ice. Smoke seeped weakly from the chimney. He crept up to the door, pressed an ear to the wood. A faint crackle from the fire. Then a cough. A human voice. Elias's jaw clenched. He pushed the latch with the barrel of his rifle, the door creaking open with a long, cold groan. Inside, the dim orange light from the hearth flickered across two huddled shapes. An old man and woman, curled together on the floor near the fire, wrapped in his blankets. Their faces were sunken, their lips cracked. The man's hand trembled as he tried to shield the woman from the draft that came with the opening door. When the wind swept in behind Elias, she gasped and clutched the man's coat tighter. The old man turned toward him, eyes glassy and full of terror. "Please," he rasped. "We didn't mean no harm. Thought the place was empty. We just needed a place to warm up." Elias didn't move for a long moment. His finger rested on the trigger, though his mind screamed at him to lower it. The smell of smoke, wet wool, and desperation filled the air. The fire crackled weakly, half-choked with ash. The woman's voice trembled. "He's sick, sir. Please don't send us out there. We'll die." Elias's gaze hardened. The wilderness didn't take kindly to trespassers, and neither did he. But looking at them, skin like paper, hands blue from cold, eyes hollow with hunger, he saw something he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, something human stirred inside him. He lowered the rifle slowly. "You're already halfway to death," he muttered, his voice low and rough. "Ain't no use throwing you out into the rest of it." He crossed the room, throwing another log on the fire. The flames licked to life, spilling light across the small cabin. The old couple watched him in stunned silence. Elias moved with quiet efficiency, kicking snow off his boots, hanging his coat, setting down his rifle by the wall. Then he turned to them, his expression unreadable. "You hungry?" The woman nodded weakly, tears glinting in her eyes. He took a small tin of salted venison from his pack and dropped it into the pot by the fire. The smell filled the room, strong, meaty, alive. For the first time in days the couple breathed deep. Elias didn't speak again for a long while. He just sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the storm rage outside. After a time the old man whispered, "God bless you, stranger." Elias's jaw flexed. He looked at the man, really looked. Thin, frail, with the same hollow look he'd once seen in his own reflection after burying his wife one winter long ago. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "Just stay alive till morning." Outside, the wind howled like it meant to tear the world apart. But inside that small cabin, for the first time in a long, long time, 3 souls shared one fire. And in that fragile light, mercy found its way back into a heart that had forgotten it existed. The dawn came slow and gray, like a wounded animal dragging itself across the mountains. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low to embers. Smoke coiled lazily up the chimney, and the scent of wood ash clung to every corner. Elias McGraw stirred from his stool by the hearth, his shoulders stiff from the night. He had kept the fire alive through the dark hours, feeding it with wood while the storm outside screamed and battered the walls. Now the wind had eased, but the world beyond the window was buried, white, endless, silent. He turned to look at the two figures sleeping by the fire. The woman's head rested on her husband's shoulder. Her silver hair spread across his blanket like fine lace. Their hands were clasped together, their breaths shallow but steady. For a long time Elias just watched them. It had been years since another human being had shared the warmth of this room. He rose quietly, stoking the fire, then fetched his pot from the corner. He melted snow in it, added a handful of dried meat and a pinch of cornmeal. The faint smell of broth filled the cabin. The sound roused the woman. She blinked, disoriented, then startled as her eyes fell on him. "Oh, sir, forgive me," she gasped softly, struggling to sit up. We didn't mean to intrude. My husband, he collapsed in the storm and when we saw smoke." Elias lifted a hand to stop her apology. "Eat first. Talk later." He ladled steaming broth into 2 wooden bowls and set them before her. She shook her head, overcome. "I can't thank you enough," she whispered. "You've saved our lives." He gave no reply, only turned away and busied himself checking his rifle. After a few sips, her husband stirred awake. The man's face was pale beneath his whiskers, his lips cracked and bleeding. He coughed into his sleeve, the sound dry and hollow. The woman, Martha, she later introduced herself, rubbed his back, whispering comfort. When the man's breathing eased, he looked up at Elias with eyes that still held the spark of dignity. "Sir, name's Silas Benton. My wife Martha. We owe you more than we can pay." Elias's gaze flicked toward them, then back to his rifle. "Ain't about owing. You needed shelter. That's all." But the tone of his voice, gruff and flat, couldn't quite hide the faint tremor of something else beneath it. As the day went on, the cabin began to thaw from the warmth of 3 bodies and a fire that no longer seemed to die down. Martha dozed under one of Elias's old quilts, her small hands clutching the fabric as though afraid it might be taken away. Silas sat propped near the window, staring at the storm outside, eyes heavy with thought. Elias repaired a broken snare line by the table, his knife scraping quietly against the wood. For a while the only sounds were the fire's pop and Martha's faint humming. A hymn from long ago, one Elias hadn't heard since his wife, Nora, used to hum it while baking bread. The melody hit something deep inside him. He paused mid-motion, blade hovering over the cord, before setting it down and walking to the window. The snow was still falling. He muttered to himself, barely audible. "Didn't figure I'd hear that song again." Martha smiled faintly from her chair. "It's one I always sing when I'm scared. Been singing it most of this winter." Her voice broke a little on the last word. By afternoon, Silas began to speak more clearly, his voice rasping but steady. "We come from the valley south o' here," he said. "Had us a small homestead by the river. Stove went bad last month, caught the cabin before we could put it out. Lost everything. Couldn't stay, no shelter, no food." He paused, his eyes distant, watery. "Thought we could make it to our daughter's place near Sweetwater. But she's 50 miles off. We only made it halfway before the storm hit. I figured we'd die out there, till we saw that smoke from your roof." Elias's jaw tightened. He looked into the fire, watching the flames lick the blackened wood. 50 miles in winter?" he muttered. "You're lucky to be breathin'. Martha nodded, tears glistening in the firelight. "We prayed for days. Then I saw that trail of smoke. I told Silas it was a sign." Elias snorted softly. "Sign or not, you picked a hard place to die in." But his words, gruff as they were, held a strange gentleness. He poured them both more broth, pushing the bowl toward Martha. She thanked him with a shaky smile. Night fell early. The storm outside built again, moaning through the gaps in the shutters. Elias patched the door with an old pelt and checked the traps hanging from the rafters, most of them empty. His supplies were thin. He'd counted enough dried meat for maybe 5 more days. 6 if he stretched it. Still, he looked over at the 2 frail figures by the fire and felt something stir inside him that he hadn't let himself feel in years. He remembered another winter, one that took his wife, his unborn child, and every reason he'd had for staying in town. That was the winter that drove him into these mountains to live alone. And now, in the same cabin where he'd buried his grief, 2 strangers were breathing the air he once cursed himself for wasting. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the fire crackled low, Martha's voice came soft in the dark. "Mr. McGraw, do you live here all alone?" He hesitated. "Ain't no one else fool enough to stay this far up the mountain." "Don't you ever get lonely?" she asked. He poked the fire with a stick, sparks drifting like fireflies into the chimney. "Lonely's a word for folks who still expect company." Neither spoke after that. The storm howled and the snow kept falling, but in that small cabin, 3 broken lives found a brief, trembling peace. And though Elias McGraw didn't know it yet, the decision to open that door would change his life forever. The storm didn't end the next day, or the day after that. By the 5th sunrise, the world outside Elias McGraw's cabin was a frozen, endless sea of white. The door had to be shouldered open each morning just to breathe the air, and even then it was like trying to inhale knives. Inside, the cabin flickered with the orange pulse of the fire, the only light left in the world. Elias had stopped marking the days with his knife on the post. Time had lost its meaning. There was only wood to split, food to ration, and silence to survive. The rhythm of survival. Each morning, Elias rose before dawn to check his snares and scrape frost from the window. The old man, Silas Benton, coughed through the night, ribs shaking with each breath. His wife, Martha, nursed him with melted snow and whatever broth Elias could stretch from the dwindling pot. They'd fallen into a fragile rhythm of existence. Elias kept the fire alive. Martha kept Silas alive. Sometimes she hummed soft hymns while stirring the pot, her cracked hands trembling as she ladled broth. Elias would glance over, his beard shadowing a face that never quite softened, but never stayed cold either. Once, when he handed her a cup of hot water, she touched his wrist with her thin fingers. "Mr. McGraw," she whispered. "You've been our guardian angel." He stiffened. "Don't call me that." When she frowned, he added, "Angels don't have blood on their hands." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't have to. The way he turned from the fire and stared out the window, had nothing but snow and memory, said plenty. Ghost of the past. That night, as the wind moaned across the roof, Elias dreamed again. He saw Nora, his wife, kneeling by their hearth years ago, smiling, her belly round with the child that never drew breath. He saw the fever take her. The snow piling on her grave when the preacher couldn't make it through the pass. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, his chest aching like the mountain itself had caved in. Martha was sitting by Silas's side, the firelight soft on her silver hair. "You were talking in your sleep," she said gently. "Said someone's name." Elias didn't meet her eyes. "Someone I buried a long time ago." She nodded, her voice tender. "God must have sent us here for a reason. Maybe so you wouldn't have to stay buried with her." He didn't answer, but something inside him cracked just a little more. The 5th night. The storm reached its worst on the 5th night. The wind howled like a beast clawing at the walls and snow leaked through every gap. Elias nailed an old fir over the window, but the draft still found its way in. Silas's breathing had grown ragged. He coughed blood now, each fit racking his frail frame until he nearly fainted. Martha wept quietly, clutching his hand. Elias crouched near the hearth, jaw tight. He'd mixed the last of the venison with boiled bark and what little flour he had left. The smell was thin and bitter. He divided the food into 3 small wooden bowls. But when Martha tried to pass one to Silas, Elias stopped her. "Give him mine," he said flatly. She looked up, startled. "You need your strength." "Don't argue," he said, eyes fixed on the fire. "He needs it more." And that night, Elias McGraw went to bed hungry. The decision. The next morning, Silas didn't wake easily. His skin had gone pale, his lips blue. Martha's hands fluttered helplessly over him as she whispered, "Please, Silas, open your eyes." Elias knelt beside her, listening to the faint rattle in the old man's chest. He'd seen that sound before, in men dying on battlefields and in his wife's final breaths. He rose abruptly and pulled on his coat. Martha looked up, alarmed. "What are you doing?" "Town's 15 miles down the pass," he muttered. "Bitter Creek. Got a doctor there. I'll fetch him." "In this weather? You'll die out there." Elias strapped his rifle to his back, stuffed what little jerky remained into his pouch, and pulled the fur hood over his head. His voice came like gravel. "Maybe. But he'll die for sure if I don't." He opened the door. The wind screamed into the room, scattering ash and snow across the floor. Martha cried out and grabbed his arm. "Why would you risk your life for us?" Elias hesitated on the threshold. The snow whipped across his face, sharp and blinding. He turned his head just enough to look at her. His eyes, cold gray and full of ghosts, softened for the first time. "Because someone once tried to save mine, and I didn't let him." Then he stepped into the storm and shut the door behind him. The white hell. The world beyond the cabin was merciless. The trail was gone, buried under 4 feet of snow. Elias leaned into the wind, each step a battle. The mountain was alive with sound, the deep groan of shifting ice, the scream of air through the pines. He stumbled once, twice, catching himself on his rifle. His breath came in sharp, painful bursts. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. But in his mind he saw Martha's tear-streaked face, and the frail, dying man gasping for air beside her fire. That vision kept him moving. By dusk, the faint outline of the valley lights shimmered through the haze. The first sight of Bitter Creek in weeks. Elias's legs gave out halfway down the hill. He crawled the last few yards through the snow until he reached the saloon's wooden steps. When he pushed the door open, the warm light inside hit him like a hammer. The townsfolk turned. A dozen pairs of eyes fixed on him. A ghost of a man, covered in frost and blood and determination. "Old couple," he rasped, voice breaking. "Up the ridge, in my cabin. Dying. Need Doc Weston." Someone muttered, "McGraw? You let people into your place." But Elias didn't hear the whispers. His knees buckled. And as the firelight swallowed him, his last thought before darkness took him was of Martha praying beside the hearth, and of a promise he'd made to the dead that he'd finally begun to keep. The saloon doors banged open as Elias McGraw crashed to the floorboards, the storm howling behind him. The sudden silence inside was thick enough to choke on. Men at the card tables froze mid-hand. The barkeep, old Nate Cormack, his beard as gray as the smoke from his lantern, stared wide-eyed. "McGraw," he muttered. "Lord Almighty, what happened to you?" Elias's hands trembled as he tried to push himself upright. Frost clung to his coat like armor, his lips purple, breath ragged. "Old couple," he gasped. "Up at my place. Half dead. Need Doc Weston, now." The room erupted in uneasy murmurs. "You mean in your cabin?" someone called. Another man, a rancher by the window, snorted. "Ain't that just like him? Probably shot him himself, now wants to play savior." The barkeep slammed his rag on the counter. "Quiet, you fool. Look at him, he's half froze to death." Elias's knees buckled again, but Doc Weston, the town physician, was already moving. A wiry man with steady hands and a calm face, he knelt beside the mountain man and pressed a hand to his chest. "You're lucky to be breathing, McGraw," Weston said evenly. "How far did you walk?" 15 miles, uphill through drift." He coughed, voice cracking. "Silas and Martha Benton. They won't make it through another night." At the mention of the names, the sheriff, Tom Riggs, tall, square-jawed, the kind of man who rarely blinked, glanced sharply at the doctor. "The Bentons?" he said. "Had a farm down south of here, didn't they?" "Aye," Weston replied. "I heard their place burned last month." The sheriff straightened, looking down at Elias. "You're saying they're in your cabin? Out there in that storm?" Elias nodded, barely able to keep his head up. "Found him half dead when I got back. Been feeding him. Man's coughing blood now." For a long moment no one moved. Then the sheriff barked orders. "Doc, get your bag. You two, grab blankets, extra horses and torches. We ride in 10 minutes. Elias tried to stand. "I'm coming with you." Weston grabbed his shoulder. "You'll die if you step back into that snow." Elias met his gaze, eyes bloodshot but unyielding. "If they die, I die anyway." The ride through the storm. They left town under a sky the color of ash. The wind clawed at their faces, tearing the breath from their lungs. The sheriff rode up front with a torch raised high, its flame bending and hissing in the gale. Behind him, Elias rode hunched over his horse, eyes half shut against the sting of ice. Each gust of wind felt like it could knock the breath out of his chest. The doctor rode beside him, his saddle creaking with each lurch of the horse. "You've got a damn death wish, McGraw," Weston said through chattering teeth. "What kind of man opens his cabin to strangers this time of year?" Elias's voice came slow, deliberate. "The kind who got tired of watching people die." They said nothing more after that. Hours passed. The trail vanished under the drifts. At times, the horses sank chest deep in snow, snorting and trembling. Once, the sheriff's torch went out, and they had to stop and relight it under Elias's coat to shield the flame. Every muscle in Elias's body screamed to stop, but the memory of Martha's face, the hollow desperation in her eyes, kept him upright. Finally, near dawn they reached the ridge. Elias raised a shaking arm. "There," he said hoarsely. "Over that rise." The sheriff squinted through the snow. A faint orange flicker burned against the white horizon. "Smoke," he said. "By God, there's life." The cabin. The men dismounted, trudging through the final stretch on foot. The wind was dying now, the storm spent but bitter. When Elias pushed open the cabin door, the smell of smoke and sickness washed over them. Martha sat by the fire, her husband's head in her lap. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her hands still stroked Silas's thin hair as if he were a child. When she saw Elias, she let out a sob of both relief and despair. He tried to hold on, she cried. Said he wanted to thank you for saving us, but he stopped breathing just before sunrise. The room went silent except for the fire's slow crackle. Elias stepped forward, every movement stiff and heavy. He sank to one knee beside Silas's still body, his breath clouding the air. The old man's eyes were closed. His hands folded neatly on his chest. "Damn it," Elias whispered. He shut his eyes for a long moment. Doc Weston removed his hat. "He went peaceful," he said quietly. "You did right by them, McGraw. No doctor could have made it in time." The sheriff looked around the cabin, at the neatly stacked woodpile, the empty food tins, the single fire keeping the place alive. His voice came out low. "Looks to me like you kept Em alive longer than anyone else could have. But not everyone saw it that way." Whispers in Bitter Creek. By the time they brought Martha down to town, the whispers had already begun. Some said Elias had killed the old man. Others said he'd gone mad up in those mountains, feeding on strangers to survive. When the sheriff tried to defend him, folks just shook their heads. "A man like that don't show mercy," they said. "Not after living alone that long." The mountain man had always been a mystery in Bitter Creek. Some remembered how he used to ride with the cavalry, others swore he'd run from a murder charge. But now, with a dead old man found in his cabin, people's imaginations filled in the blanks with cruelty. Elias stayed silent through it all. He didn't defend himself, didn't argue. When the preacher asked him if the rumors were true, he only said, "Believe what you will." But that night, as he sat outside the sheriff's office under the flickering lamplight, he whispered something to himself, words no one else heard. "If mercy's a sin, then I reckon I'll hang for it." The aftermath. Martha was taken to the church, where the women of the town gave her warm clothes and soup. She spoke little, but when the sheriff visited her later, she said, "That man saved our lives. You tell your people that." The sheriff nodded. "They'll come around, ma'am. Sooner or later." But Elias knew better. The West had long memory and little forgiveness. He returned to his cabin 2 days later, alone. The snow had crusted over the tracks of their journey. Inside, he buried Silas behind the cabin under a pine tree, where the snow fell soft and silent. He didn't pray. But he stood there a long while, his hat clutched in his hands, until the wind carried his breath away. And though the mountain was quiet, he swore he could almost hear a voice, thin and frail but peaceful, whispering, "You did right, son. You did right." The sun rose weakly over Bitter Creek, a pale disk struggling to pierce the fog of gossip that hung over the town like smoke from a dying fire. 3 days had passed since the mountain man returned from his cabin. 3 days since old Silas Benton's body was laid in the frozen ground behind the church. But already tongues had sharpened sharper than axes. The whispers begin. It started in Nate Cormack's saloon, as most trouble in Bitter Creek did. A trapper leaned across the bar and muttered, "Ain't natural, him livin' up there all alone. Found 2 starvin' strangers, he says?" Maybe they found him first. Another man spat tobacco into a tin. Doc Weston said the old man was already near dead when they got there. "Yeah," the trapper replied. Or maybe McGraw finished the job to keep his cabin to himself. Laughter rippled low and mean. The barkeep frowned. "Watch your mouths. That man saved more lives than most of you ever tried." But few listened. By sundown, the story had changed twice. Elias had refused to share food, then that he'd locked them in his cabin, then that he'd eaten what little they had left. By nightfall, the town that once merely avoided Elias McGraw now openly despised him. The sheriff's visit. Sheriff Tom Riggs rode out to the edge of town where Elias had been staying in an old storage barn behind the livery. He found him there, sharpening a knife by lantern light, face unreadable. "Word spreading fast," Riggs said as he dismounted. "You know how folks are. Once they get a story, truth don't stand a chance." Elias didn't look up. "Let him talk." Riggs crossed his arms. "You sure you're doing yourself any favors sitting out here like a ghost? Martha Benton's down at the church. Folks might believe her if she speaks up." Elias's hands paused. "She don't owe me that. She owes you her life, McGraw." He finally set the knife down, his expression grim. "The way I see it, I didn't save her to clear my name. I did it, 'cause no one else would." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. You ever get tired of being misunderstood? He asked quietly. Elias gave a half-smile without warmth. You don't live long in these hills expecting folks to understand you. Riggs sighed. For what it's worth, I believe you. He turned to leave but not before adding, just watch your back, Elias. Not everyone in Bitter Creek is fond of letting a man's sins, or his kindness, go unpunished. The church gathering. 2 nights later, the preacher called a town meeting at the church. The benches filled fast, ranchers, wives, miners and farmers, all bundled in wool and suspicion. Martha Benton sat near the front, her shawl pulled tight, hands trembling slightly. Reverend Phelps cleared his throat. We gather to remember Silas Benton, a good man, and to speak of the mercy that carried him through his final days. From the back, a voice interrupted. Mercy? You mean the mercy of that wild man up in the hills? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phelps frowned. Brother, we're not here to pass judgment. But the man, a blacksmith named Orrin Blake, stood up. Then I will. That feller's been trouble since he came to these parts. Ain't right livin' like a wolf. Now he's mixed up with a dead man, and we're just supposed to thank him for it. Martha rose slowly, her voice shaking but firm. You don't know what you're saying. Blake sneered. You'd defend him, missus? Maybe he fooled you same as he's foolin' the rest of us. Her frail figure straightened, fire sparking behind her tired eyes. That man carried my husband through a blizzard. Fed us with his last food. Sat by his bedside all night, praying he'd wake. He saved my life, and he never once asked for thanks. The church fell silent. Even the blacksmith looked down at his boots. Phelps bowed his head. Sometimes the Lord sends angels in strange shapes, friends. We best be careful which ones we call monsters. Martha turned toward the door and left quietly, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. The rocks in the snow. The next morning, Elias walked down Main Street for supplies. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A boy threw a pebble that struck his shoulder. His mother didn't stop him. Elias kept walking, eyes forward, jaw set. He reached the general store, bought flour, matches and salt. The clerk didn't meet his eyes. When Elias laid down a coin, the man used tongs to pick it up. Storm's comin' again, Elias said. The clerk muttered, maybe it'll clean the mountain this time. Elias's hand clenched, but he said nothing. He stepped back into the snow, the door swinging shut behind him with a hollow thud. From the saloon window, a few men watched him go. He'll leave soon, one said. Men like that always do. But they were wrong. Elias McGraw wasn't leaving. Not this time. The sheriff's warning. That night, the sheriff found him saddling his horse outside the livery. You headin' back up there? Riggs asked. Elias nodded. Storm's comin'. Gotta board up the place before it buries the roof. Riggs looked uneasy. Town's still talkin'. Some folks think maybe you ought not come back at all. Elias gave a half-smile. Tell 'em not to worry. I never needed their welcome. He mounted his horse, snow beginning to fall in lazy spirals. The sheriff called after him, You saved lives, Elias. Don't let their ignorance turn you bitter. The mountain man looked over his shoulder. Too late for that, Tom. Cold gets into a man after enough winters. Then he nudged his horse forward and rode into the storm. The flakes swallowed him whole, and by the time the sheriff turned back toward town, Elias McGraw was gone again, vanishing into the wilderness that made him and nearly broke him. But the storm he rode into was nothing compared to the one waiting for him when the truth finally came down from the mountain. The storm came harder than anyone in Bitter Creek expected. By nightfall, the whole town lay buried under a thick, merciless white. Roofs cracked under the weight, doors froze shut, and the sound of the wind howling down Main Street was like wolves crying for the dead. And somewhere up there, beyond the ridge and the timberline, Elias McGraw was alone again. The mountain awakens. For 3 days no one saw smoke from his chimney. Sheriff Tom Riggs watched from the edge of town through his spyglass, hoping to see a thread of gray against the white peaks, but there was nothing. Storm might have buried his place, said the deputy, tightening his scarf. Riggs didn't answer. He just kept watching. Finally, on the morning of the 4th day, he saw it, a faint, crooked ribbon of smoke curling into the pale sky. He exhaled slowly. He made it. But not everyone was relieved. In the saloon, some men muttered that the smoke meant something else, that Elias had gone mad, burning what was left of his cabin to stay warm. Others said he was lighting a signal for whatever evil he kept in those woods. By evening, the fear had grown into something worse, guilt. Martha's decision. At the church, Martha Benton sat by the window, staring out at the falling snow. Her hands trembled around the cup of tea someone had given her. Reverend Phelps entered quietly. "You should rest, Mrs. Benton. The doctor says the cold's not good for your lungs." She didn't look at him. "He's still up there, isn't he? Alone?" The Reverend nodded slowly. Her eyes glistened. "That man carried my husband through death itself, and now he's the one the town left to freeze." "Martha," Phelps said gently, "you can't go back up there. Not in this weather." She turned toward him, her face set with the stubbornness only grief can forge. "I was half dead when he found me," she said. "If there's breath left in me now, it's because he gave it. I won't let him die alone." Before dawn, she wrapped herself in a wool coat, took a lantern and started walking toward the ridge. The frozen path. The trail was half buried, the snow waist-deep in places. Martha's legs ached, her lungs burned, and her lantern's flame flickered in the wind. She whispered a prayer with each step. "Lord, keep him alive. Let me find him before the cold does." By midday her strength was nearly gone, but then through the blur of falling snow she saw it. Elias's cabin, roof bowed but still standing, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. She stumbled forward and knocked weakly at the door. Inside there was silence for a heartbeat, then slow, heavy footsteps. The latch lifted and the door creaked open. Elias stood there, gaunt, pale and exhausted, but alive. His beard was rimed with frost, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "Martha," he rasped, stunned. "What in God's name?" "I had to see if you were still breathing," she said, and nearly collapsed into his arms. He caught her, steadying her against the warmth of the fire. "You're mad," he murmured, half in awe. "Storm near killed you." She looked up at him with a small, trembling smile. "Wouldn't be the first time someone dragged me out of the snow." The truth beneath the floorboards. Once Martha had warmed by the fire, Elias poured her a cup of broth and said quietly, "I buried him proper. Behind the pine just like he wanted." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you." But then her gaze fell to the corner of the cabin, where a patch of floorboards had been pried up, a hole dug beneath. Inside was a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. "What's that?" she asked softly. Elias hesitated. "Something I found after the storm. Figured you should see it." He handed her the box. Inside were a handful of gold coins, a faded marriage license and a folded piece of paper, stained with blood. Martha's hands trembled as she opened it. It was Silas Benton's handwriting. "To whoever finds us, don't blame this man. He gave us warmth when the Lord had already called me home. If my Martha lives, it's by his mercy. I go to sleep in peace knowing kindness still walks this earth." Her tears splashed onto the page. Elias turned away, jaw tight. "I was gonna take it to the sheriff after the snow eased up. But I reckon it'll mean more comin' from you." Martha pressed the letter to her chest, her voice breaking. "They'll know, Elias. I'll make them know." He shook his head. "Truth don't melt ice hearts easy." "Then we'll burn it hotter," she said fiercely. "Together." The town's reckoning. 2 days later, when the roads cleared, Martha rode back down with the letter in her coat. The sheriff met her at the church steps, surprised she was still alive. "I have proof," she said simply. When Reverend Phelps read the note aloud at Sunday service, the congregation sat in stunned silence. Some wept. Others bowed their heads. Even the blacksmith who had accused Elias looked hollow, his face red with shame. The sheriff cleared his throat, voice rough. "Seems we owe a man an apology, one that might be too big to speak." From the back of the church, a quiet voice answered. "Then don't speak it. Show it." Heads turned. There in the doorway, dusty, solemn and tall as the pines, stood Elias McGraw. The return. For a moment no one breathed. Then Martha rose from her seat and crossed the aisle. She placed the letter in the preacher's hands and looked at Elias. "Told you we'd burn it hotter." He gave her a small nod, his eyes softening. "You sure did, ma'am." Reverend Phelps looked out over the pews. "Seems the Lord sent us a lesson on mercy. The kind that freezes a man to test his soul, and thaws him to test ours." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, quiet, and clean. Elias stepped into the light spilling through the church window, and for the first time in years the people of Bitter Creek didn't see a wild man. They saw the man who had carried 2 strangers through death and still had room in his heart for grace. The winter of 1881 ended slowly in Bitter Creek, as if the mountains themselves were reluctant to release their hold. The snow melted by inches, not rivers. The roads turned from white to gray to the rich brown of thawing earth. And for the first time in years, the townsfolk didn't whisper when they spoke the name Elias McGraw. They spoke it with respect. And with a touch of shame. A town's change of heart. In the weeks after Silas Benton's letter was read aloud, something shifted in Bitter Creek. The blacksmith, Orrin Blake, left a pile of fresh-cut wood outside the sheriff's office one morning with a note, for McGraw. The general store owner who once used tongs to take Elias's coins began setting aside supplies for him. Flour, jerky, coffee, and said quietly, "On the house." It wasn't much, but it was a start. When Elias rode down from his mountain that spring, folks didn't turn away anymore. Some nodded. Some tipped their hats. He never asked for forgiveness and they never asked for his favor. But something unspoken passed between them, something truer than words. The kind of peace that can only grow in soil once bitter, now thawed. Martha's new life. Martha Benton never left Bitter Creek after that winter. She stayed on in a small cabin by the church, tending to the sick, helping widows and drifters who came through town. When people asked why she did it, she would only smile softly and say, "Because a stranger once saved my life, expecting nothing in return." Children loved her stories about the mountain, about the cabin, the storm, and the man who had carried her husband through the blizzard. They called him the hermit saint behind her back, though Elias would have laughed himself hoarse at the name. Martha lived to be 87. In her final days, she often stared north toward the ridge where the snow never melted and whispered, "He's still up there. I can feel his fire." Elias's quiet years. For his part, Elias McGraw returned to his solitude. But it was no longer the solitude of exile, it was peace. Each spring he rode down with supplies for the town orphanage. Each fall, he brought bundles of fur and meat to the church before winter locked the mountains again. He never attended Sunday service, but the preacher once found a small carved cross left on the church steps, rough, hand-shaped, and stained with pine sap. By the time word reached town that Elias McGraw had passed years later, no one knew the exact day. The sheriff found him in his cabin, seated by the hearth, a book open in his lap, the fire burned down to glowing coals. He looked peaceful. Almost as if he'd fallen asleep listening to the mountain breathe. The legacy. The townsfolk buried him beside Silas Benton, under the same pine where the snow first melted each spring. Martha herself had requested that spot years before. The preacher said a few words, simple but true. He came to this world a man, but he left it a lesson. After that, Bitter Creek changed forever. No one locked their doors to strangers in the cold again. Every time a lost traveler wandered through the valley, someone would whisper, "Best take him in. You remember what happened to the mountain man." And every winter, when the snow began to fall heavy and the smoke from cabin chimneys curled high into the sky, the children of Bitter Creek would say, "Look, Elias's fire's still burning." Their parents would smile and nod, though the man had been gone for years, because they all knew some fires never die. They just move from the hearth to the heart. Wide shot, a snow-covered ridge in the dawn light. The wind hums low through the pines. The camera drifts slowly toward a small, weathered cabin half buried in snow. Inside, the hearth glows faintly. A single ember, still alive, flickers in the ashes. Then a spark. It flares, bright and brief, before fading to gold. The mountain exhales a long, gentle sigh. And the screen fades to black. The fire that never died. A tale of mercy, memory, and the kind of goodness that outlives even the harshest winters.